Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Cynthia Olivo. I am the Vice President of Student Services here at Pasadena City College. And I've been at this college for 8 years, since 2008, 2009 academic year. I started as the Dean of Counseling and Student Success Services. At that point, I was finishing my dissertation. I completed my PhD at Claremont Graduate University, and my focus was on researching effective strategies for helping Latino students to succeed. And guess who I got to study a lot of their work? The speaker that we are about to hear today. To me, he is a major player in our community in education to help us determine what are effective strategies for helping one of the largest populations of students in our higher education system, and that is how to help Latino students. I think it's important for us to create a space to be specific about research and practice so that we can all learn to do our best for our students. I am proud to work at a college where we have intentionally tried to improve what we do for students, to the point that just last week I was in Washington, D.C. representing PCC because we were selected as one of the top 10 community colleges in the entire nation. One of the major pieces of data that the Aspen Institute tracks is our 3-year completion rate for students from historically underrepresented groups to see if we've increased it over a 3-year period. That's the data that I'm the most proud of because it reveals where our heart is and where we need to continue to make improvements. So I think bringing scholars here today, like Dr. Daniel Solorzano from UCLA, will continue to help us grow and learn what we need to do to help students. So if you would please help me give such a warm welcome to a fellow alum of Claremont Graduate University, a major scholar in education from UCLA faculty. He is an author, a researcher, a teacher. Please help me welcome Dr. Daniel Solorzano.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I was here about a year ago? I gave a presentation on community college, I believe it was, wasn't it? Yes. And it's for a scholarship. It's part of the scholarship event here at PCC. But thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate being here. The title of my presentation, I'm going to talk about microaggressions. And the title is Using the Tools of Racial Microaggressions to Study Everyday Racism. What are they, or what they are, and why they matter? And so just a show of hands, how many people in the room have heard of the concept of racial microaggressions? Okay, it's getting around. If I had asked this question about 5 years ago, I would have had maybe 2 or 3 hands go up. I've been doing this work for about a little over 20 years now on racial microaggressions. And see, and what you're going to get is a little bit of the history of how I do the work, why I do the work, why I think it's important. But before I say that, before I get to that point, I want to, as Olivia mentioned, I'm at UCLA. I've been there for 27 years on the faculty in education, and I also have another appointment in the Chicana and Chicano Studies department there at UCLA. But that's not where I started. I've been in higher education now for 44 years. Actually, I started in secondary school. So my first appointment was at the LA County Juvenile Hall in Lincoln Heights. I was a social studies teacher there. I taught high school. And that's really where I began learning my craft, or learning our craft of teaching. I mean, I taught young men. I was on what they call the boys' side, young men who were incarcerated and who were on their way to court or on their way to camps. And so by state law, you have to teach them. They have to take classes. So I taught social studies there at the LA County Juvenile Hall. I went on to teach at Santa Monica College. So I taught at Santa Monica in the sociology department for about 3 years or so. Excuse me. I went to East LA College and taught for 10 years in the Chicano Studies department there at ELAC. I went on to teach at Cal State Northridge in the Chicano Studies department. And then I ended up at Cal State Bakersfield in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And then I got asked to apply to a position at UCLA, and that's where I ended up back at UCLA. So my pathway to UCLA is not your traditional pathway. Most of my colleagues at UCLA have never taught in the community colleges and have rarely taught in the CSU system. And I have the honor and privilege of having taught in all three segments of California post-secondary education: the California Community College system, the California State University system, and the University of California system. And so I hope that over the years I've learned from all of my students in each of these systems about my craft, which is teaching and research also. And so I want to honor them. And so the question I'm going to ask a couple of questions actually. I'm going to try to answer in the next 45 minutes or so. What are racial microaggressions? Right? We're going to try to answer that question because there's some controversy around the concept of racial microaggressions. And we may talk about that concept or that controversy as we move through this presentation. And finally, why do they matter? Why do racial microaggressions matter? And so the concept of racial microaggressions begins in 1969 when it was first used by this person, Chester Pierce. Dr. Pierce. Chet was a professor, is now emeritus, and unfortunately now has passed on in this last year, was a professor emeritus at Harvard University in two schools. He was at the Graduate School of Education and at the School of Medicine. He was a psychiatrist. And he basically coined the term and used the term racial microaggressions back in 1969. I came across the term in about 1993. And when I first seen this term or heard this term, I had no idea what he was talking about. It was new to me as someone who does race research. It was a new concept. And so I read everything he had written on this concept. And I began to then write and do research on the concept of racial microaggressions. And I began to do that in the mid-1990s, and I've continued it along with my students now, my doctoral students, to the present. So how do we define, if you're in my doctoral seminar, which meets tonight, week 11, we're the last class tonight. I got to go back to UCLA at 5 o'clock. I'll be back at 5 o'clock for my class. If you're in my seminar, the one thing you're going to get in the 10 or 11 weeks you're with me is that define your concepts. Because if you don't define your concepts, someone will do it for you, and they'll probably get it wrong. And so as a researcher, as a scholar, you have to define what you're talking about. And so I try to have very clear definitions of the concepts that I use in my work. And so how do I define racial microaggressions? So I define it as racial microaggressions are one form of systemic everyday racism used to keep those at the racial margins in their place. I'm a sociologist, right? I'm a sociologist of education. So I look at racial microaggressions not as a psychologist or not as a social psychologist. I look at everyday racism as a sociologist. So I place the concept of racial microaggressions within systems of everyday racism, institutions of everyday racism, as you'll see in a second. And I also argue the way we use racial microaggressions is to keep people of color in their place. That's how we use them. And I'll try to give examples of that as we move along. So I go on to say racial microaggressions are verbal and nonverbal assaults. They're assaults directed towards people of color, often carried out in subtle, automatic, or unconscious forms. So my work deals with people of color. So when someone comes up to me and asks me, Danny or Professor Solorzano, do you do work on microaggressions and other populations? And I said, no, I do work on people of color. That's my research. There are other people who do work on microaggressions. I do work on gender microaggressions, but gender microaggressions as they apply to women of color, right? And so that's my work. I don't do work on disability microaggressions. Some of my graduate students do, right? Daryl Sue at Columbia University does some amazing work in this area. But I like to be clear in the beginning of a presentation of the work that I do, right? And I can share with you or tell you who's doing other work, but this is the work that I do. So they're assaults, and they're verbal and nonverbal assaults. So sometimes it's what we hear in conversation. I'll give you some examples in a second. But sometimes they're nonverbal assaults, right? They can be visualizations of microaggressions, visual microaggressions. We'll talk about those in a second. They're layered assaults. So they often start with a person of color, her race or his race, but they quickly can move into their gender, their social class, their sexuality, their language, their immigration status, their phenotype, their accent, or their surname. So there are these layered assaults that people experience in the everyday, right? So it often starts with racism or race, but it quickly can turn into other forms of intersectional microaggressions, like in the case, gender, social class, immigration status, etc. And then finally, they're cumulative assaults. And I need to emphasize this, is that sometimes people will when I talk about racial microaggressions, will say, well, that was only one experience that you had, a one-off. And the bottom line is that no, in our research on racial microaggressions, these are experiences that happen often every day, often multiple times a day. And we look at the cumulative impact on everyday racism, on the person on the receiving end, in this case, a person of color. So they're verbal and nonverbal assaults, they're layered assaults, and they're cumulative assaults. And I use the word assault purposefully. So here's a model that we use for understanding racial microaggressions. And so we have racial microaggressions in the center of this model. And as I said, as a sociologist, I see racial microaggressions, or everyday forms of racism, taking place within the context of institutional racism. Okay? So we have a perpetrator, and there's a controversy around my use of the word perpetrator. Some people say that I shouldn't use that word, and if they want to use another word, they do their own research. But I'm using the word perpetrator. Some people are using the word deliverer of microaggressions, which I think is interesting. And I use the primary target of the microaggression. Some people say we should use the word recipient of the microaggression. I don't use that word recipient. I use the word target of the microaggression. And we'll call that person Robert for the moment. But here's some research that I think, if there's someone in the room looking for a research topic, we could talk about this after. What we're not looking at as much, and I think we should be, is secondary targets. Have you ever been in a situation where you hear something about someone else? It's not directed towards you, but you hear it. You're still affected. You're the secondary target. We don't do enough research in that area of secondary targets of racial microaggressions. And I think there needs to be more of that work. We'll call her Mary for the moment. The perpetrator is Allison. Okay? She's the perpetrator in this scenario. And then, so here's what Allison says. Talking about Robert. Says, Robert, I didn't think blacks were good in science, but you are. Okay? So Robert, to himself, he says this, did she just say that? Then he responds, then how do you think of me? To Allison. Or he might say, or how else do you think of black people? So Allison says, I think you misinterpreted. That's not what I meant. So now the backtracking is taking place, right? She's backing up. And this often happens when people check people who say comments like that. Or she'll say, but I meant as a compliment. I guess you didn't ask Robert if that was a compliment. You're being too sensitive. Often about race, or about gender, or about that intersection of race and gender. Or she'll say, it was just a joke. Come on, Robert, get a sense of humor. Right? Or she might say, Don't act like a victim, Robert. So she comes back with these responses that basically devalue what Robert's experiencing. And so my work, I don't look at the intent of Allison or the perpetrator. Other people do that work. I mentioned Daryl Sue at Columbia University looks at the intent of the perpetrator along with the impact on the target of the racial microaggression, because he's in a counseling psychology program. So he looks at dyads. He looks at counselor-client dyads. So he has to look at these things. I don't look at these things. Because the reason I don't look at intent is because Allison can backtrack in so many different ways, and you get Robert confused or Mary confused about what's happening with that response. I don't look at intent. I look at the impact. The impact of that everyday form of racism on the target, the primary and hopefully eventually secondary targets of those racial microaggressions, the Roberts and Marys of the world. The implicit bias work, which is work that's in the last 3-4 years has become really popular in various contexts, whether it's a university or a college context, or police departments are doing implicit bias trainings all across the country. I know we had them at UCLA for our faculty, implicit bias trainings. I say that implicit bias work focuses on the intent of the perpetrator of the microaggression. It's an intent-centered model, right? I would argue that racial microaggressions, my work focuses on the targets of the microaggression. It's an effects-centered model. And that's the difference between implicit bias research and the work I do on racial microaggressions. I think the implicit bias work is good, it's important, but I'm not sure if it really puts enough emphasis on the target of that bias or of that assaultive microaggression that I talked about earlier. So here's the model that I use to try to understand. I'll walk you through this model with various examples for understanding racial microaggressions. So you have the types of racial microaggressions, you have the context in which they occur, you have the effects of the microaggression on the target of the microaggression, and then you have the response to those microaggressions by the person of color, the person on the receiving end. So that's the basic model that we use. And so the types and context, give you some examples. So I'm going to read this quote. It said, instead, they will make assumptions about who they think you are based on their limited notion of the world. We've felt the sting of those daily slights throughout our entire lives. The folks who cross the street in fear of their safety. The clerks who kept a close eye on us in all those department stores. The people at formal events who assumed we were the help. And those who have questioned our intelligence, our honesty, even our love of this country. Anyone know who this is? Michelle Obama. In a commencement dress at Tuskegee University 2 springs ago. Tuskegee is an historically black college in the South. And she gave this talk to the graduating class at Tuskegee that spring. And in that quote, in that part of her speech, she never used the word racial microaggressions. But it was all through that speech, or at least all through that segment of the speech, right? And if you've read any of President Obama's speeches, he does the same thing. He talks about these everyday forms of racism that he's experienced throughout his life. And so that's an example of a type and context. I'm not sure if any of you have seen Hidden Figures, the movie on African-American women at what became NASA. And if you look at that film, see, I'm not sure if you want to come to watch movies with me, but when I watch film, I'm analyzing, using my critical race lens, I'm analyzing what's happening in those films. And so that film begins with these 3 African-American scientists. Their car got stalled on the highway, and the police officer pulls up and can't believe that they're scientists at NASA. He finally, I guess, figures out that they are, because I think they showed him their work documents, and then, which sounds sort of interesting, he sort of gives them a police escort to work. Evidently, some of the things in Hidden Figures didn't really happen, they talked about them. But these three women, if going back to the film, their experience with everyday racism in that film are all through that film. Whether it was having to go to a colored-only restroom, a half a mile away, or whether it was not drinking out of a particular coffee pot in their research site, or other examples, or couldn't go take a class at a high school because the school was segregated. And she was already had her master's degree, but couldn't take a high school class because she was African American, and she wanted to move up within her research site. But these three women, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Dorothy Vaughan, are an amazing it's an amazing story. What I wanted to see as part of the story, though, two things. One is that they all went to historically black colleges. They all got their degrees at historically black universities, college universities. Never mentioned that in the movie. I wish they would have. And they were all members of Alpha Kappa Alpha. They're all members of a black sorority. I thought that would have been a really important part of that story, but it wasn't. But I didn't write the script. I didn't direct the film. But I think there are parts of that story that I think would have been helpful to put their lives in context. But I think it's an important film. There's a film that it's been out for a couple of weeks, Get Out. I'm not sure if anybody has seen it. I wish I had seen it. I wanted to see it over the weekend before this presentation because my students are telling me, my graduate students are telling me, this is all about everyday racism. It's all about racial microaggressions. In fact, I've been reading the reviews, and almost all the reviews mention the word racial microaggression in the review. And so the New York Times did this story on Jordan Peele, the director of the film. They called it on a truly terrifying monster, racism. But if you read through that review, it talks about everyday racism, and they even mention the word racial microaggressions in that review. So this is, again, I got to see this film, and I got to come back and sort of talk about this film. But I'll be looking at that film through both a critical race lens, but also through the prism of racial microaggressions. So more types in context. Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign that led up to the election in November. And so here's an example of what was happening around the country. And this is just an example because it was happening throughout the country. I'm just giving you one example, but I have multiple examples that I can share with you, but it would take too long. And I only have, 45 minutes or so. But this is McDowell High School in Asheville, North Carolina in June of 2016. And the students posted this on, I think it was Facebook or Instagram, there at the high school. And that young man in the front has a Trump t-shirt, the one sitting right in the middle with that black t-shirt with the white letters says Donald Trump or Trump. And so, what the sign says that, or what the sign said in the Facebook posting is that we built the wall first. So what's behind there, all these boxes, they went out and they got boxes and they built this wall and they stood in front of this wall, this Asheville, North Carolina. And so I don't care about the intent of those high school students. What I care about the impact on Latino students at that school, because that's what it was directed towards. It wasn't directed towards white students. It wasn't directed towards anybody else but Latino students at that high school, right? So that's one of the reasons why I don't do intent-based research, because it sort of masks, it moves us away from what I think is important, at least in my research, is look at the impact that these types of events have on those on the receiving end of this. The superintendent, by the way, of that school district said there is nothing offensive in the photo. So he wasn't looking at the same photo I was looking at, obviously, or the students were looking at. But I suppose it didn't matter to him. As far as he was concerned, it wasn't offensive, right? Nicholas Kristof is a New York Times opinion writer. He's written a series on white privilege that I would really recommend you take a look at. Just Google Nicholas Kristof, and look at his white privilege pieces. He has about 7 or 8 of them right now. This was one of them that he put out in August of last summer. It says, Donald Trump is making America meaner. And so in this article in the New York Times, this is what he said. He said, But in the middle of a physics class at the high school one day, this is in Oregon, this spring, a group of white students suddenly began jeering at Latino classmates and chanting, "Build the wall, build the wall." Right? So what the Latino students did is they walked out. They basically went on strike. We're seeing this all across the country, by the way, where Latino students are being confronted with these issues, and they're walking out. And they're walking out of places like Asheville, North Carolina, Forest Grove, Oregon, Ames, Iowa, all across the country where Latinos are, and Latinos are everywhere now. Look at the demographics. They're being confronted with these everyday forms of racism that were always there. But I think the Trump campaign just sort of really brought it to a different level. Really brought it to a different level. And so I didn't expect, and this is my own sort of bias, I suppose, my own ignorance, I suppose, but I didn't expect this to be happening in Forest Grove, Oregon, or Asheville, North Carolina, or Ames, Iowa. I didn't expect it. But as I've been doing this research, I'm finding it's happening all across the country, right? I'm calling them racial microaggressions because they're happening in the everyday, right? And so it happened in one of our sister campuses in the University of California, UC Davis. This was, again, last spring. Messages unwelcome, UCSD says. So this is what, at the Centro, UCSD Raza Resource Centro, this happened overnight. Students basically, or somebody came and chalked the front of the Centro. This is what they put. They put "Build the wall" in chalk, "Deport them all, Mexico will pay." Again, another example on a university campus where this is happening, and this isn't the only university campus where it's happening. There's a report out of the Southern Poverty Law Center called The Trump Effect that I really recommend you download and see. It's really high school, elementary, middle, and high school teachers who are basically talking about how this Trump effect has made its way into their schools and often into their classrooms. And so they're talking about how this sort of language, this sort of vile language of the Trump campaign, and one could argue it hasn't ended after he became president, how it impacted students. And in particular, how students felt more emboldened to make claims in various contexts, targeting, undocumented students, immigrant students, regardless of their documentation. Because sometimes they don't know if they're undocumented, but they see immigrant, right? And Muslim students and other students who the Trump campaign has sort of marginalized, and worse. In the post-presidential election, Steve Lopez, who writes for the LA Times, wrote this article, I think a couple days after the election, I think 1 or 2 days later. And he says something that many of us were worried about, concerned about, is how children were going to be affected by that presidency and the fear that was going to make its way into our schools, into our classrooms. And he wrote this amazing piece, this opinion piece, called "The Children Are Afraid, LA Latinos Fear a Trump Presidency." There's others right after, students from LAUSD. I'm not sure Pasadena followed suit, but LAUSD students, 4,000 of them, walked out of 18 high schools in LAUSD on, I think, the 14th or 15th of November in protest to the election of Donald Trump, right? This walkout was bigger than the walkouts that we often sort of look at historically, the East LA walkouts in 1968. This was a much larger walkout and a much more widespread walkout. And it not only included Latino students, it included black students and white students as well, right? People were walking out of school, and they continue to. I'm on the board of we have a school, UCLA has a school called the UCLA Community School in Koreatown, and it's a part of LAUSD. And our students there have been walking out, have been protesting ever since the election. Ever since the election, they've been engaged with other high schools in the area, with marches to City Hall, with marches to the LA Unified School District offices. But they're taking this very serious, what's been happening to not just immigrant students, but Muslim students as well, and other students who've been marginalized in the post-election period. Again, teachers have been affected, and I've been talking to teachers in my own school, we have a teacher education program there at UCLA, but I've also been talking to the UTLA, United Teachers of Los Angeles, the union. I've been talking to teachers in the union about what they're going through, what they're experiencing in their schools and in their classrooms. And really, this article, if you take a look at this in the LA Times in November, What Do We Tell Them Now, it's titled. It's about what teachers are going through and what do they tell their students. And so again, I really recommend you take a look at or do some of the research in this area because it's really, really important. So, what you to take away from that part of the presentation is the micro and microaggression does not mean less than. Despite what Allison said, right, in her response to the target of that microaggression, Robert, the micro and microaggression does not mean less than. The micro and microaggression means in the everyday, right? So again, getting back to definitions, I'm clear that that's what I mean by the word microaggression, that it means in the everyday, and it doesn't mean less than. Because I get pushback all the time from folks who say, well, it's just minor. It's just, you're taking this too serious, right? Trying to diminish the experiences of people on the receiving end of those racial microaggressions. So some of the effects of racial microaggressions in the everyday. So we have this sort of, the next part of that model. So a couple of things happen, a number of things happen, and I've just included just a group of them. They're very painful. For those on the receiving end of the racial microaggression, these are very painful experiences. They're hurtful experiences in so many different ways that if we had more time here, I'd love to sort of engage you in a conversation about how you experienced them and how they affected you, right, in various contexts. You get angry, you get stressed, experiencing these in the everyday. What my colleague at the University of Utah, William Smith, calls racial battle fatigue sets in. You doubt yourself, right? Or the imposter syndrome sets in. When are they going to find out I don't belong here? Right? It affects academic performance. We know that from some of the research, that these stressors, these everyday stressors of race and racism impact academic performance. And finally, poor health outcomes. There's more and more research on the health outcomes or the effects of everyday racism on people's everyday health. Right? I have a doctoral student right now, Kenjus Watson, who's looking at black males, and he's looking at how everyday racism of college students, and I can't name the university, you can probably figure out one of them, but he's doing this comparative study where he's looking at the effects of everyday racism on African-American male health outcomes. Some really important research. Why I think it's important also, it's not coming out of the School of Public Health, School of Medicine, it's coming out of the School of Education, right? So we're actually doing research in School of Education that borrows from and utilizes some of the tools and resources in our sister schools there at UCLA in the School of Public Health, School of Medicine. So he's an amazing young scholar who'll be out in about a year, and I recommend you take a look at his work. So racial battle fatigue, as I mentioned earlier, William Smith's concept, if you want to read about it in a letter, an amazing letter from Ta-Nehisi Coates to his son, I would recommend, if you haven't already read it, Between the World and Me. It's a painful book to read, but it's really a letter to his son, right? And this idea of letter, or what I call epistolary method, I think is really, really powerful. I can have a whole different discussion. I know some of you in Puente are talking about counter stories, right? I would love to talk to you about how we use epistolary method, letter writing as counter story. This is an example of it. Although he never called it that, but I'm a researcher, right? I look at things and I analyze things, and that's how I see it. This is a beautiful epistolary he wrote, a letter he wrote to his son. A painful letter also that he wrote to his son. So some of the responses to racism in the everyday. The next part of the model. Sometimes we deny they exist. I mean, sometimes people will say that didn't happen because maybe they don't want to be targeted as someone who's a victim, right? That happens. I mean, it probably happens in our own families where people say, that's not what that was. I think you misinterpreted that, Danny. All right. Okay. You police yourself. Have you ever been in a situation where You don't go to certain stores, certain restaurants, certain markets, certain places, because you don't want to deal with what you experienced in the past or what you know other people have experienced in the past. Right? Sometimes we do that. We basically police ourselves. We don't go to certain places. I'm a little older generation than most people in this room, I think. But, cities around the country, and certainly Southern California was no different, we had what they called sundown towns here in Southern California. These were towns that you had to leave before sundown if you're a person of color, African American or Mexican, right? And so right down the road here was what we thought was a sundown town, Glendale, California, right? I'll tell you another sundown town, Southgate, California. And you probably think, Southgate, you're crazy. Well, when I was growing up, Southgate was 98, 99% white. Bell was 98, 99% white. Maywood, Cudahy, all those communities just east of Alameda were predominantly white. And blacks did not cross Alameda. There's a whole different presentation I can share with you about that color line in LA, Southern California history called Alameda, right? But it basically, if you look at that history, black people, Latinos, did not move east of Alameda, right? Because of what happened to them if they went into those cities and towns back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Various art forms. This is something that I think I'm really interested in doing more research. And again, if some of you want to do this research, I really applaud it and would support it. And hopefully someone will support it here, maybe in the Puente program or Ujima, the African American Studies Center here. This idea of using art, using humor, using music, using dance, using various art forms, theater, as a response to everyday racism. Right? I mean, for me, film is that response. Maybe Get Out is that response. That's what I got. I'll be looking at Get Out from that perspective, right? That it's an art form basically as a response to racism, in this case, racial microaggressions. But this morning, I don't know if any of you probably, I was watching that morning program on CBS, and Gayle King did an interview with Dave Chappelle. Go and Google it tonight. Check it out. It's a really good interview because I think Dave Chappelle's work is an example of how a comedian basically gives us the responses to racism, both structural racism, but also racism in the everyday. I don't know if any of you remember his Comedy Central series, right? I think it was on for 2 years, right? I've used that in my classes. Not all of it. Some of it I probably won't use, but haven't used. But there's some that is really good stuff. It's really good work. And so humor, I think, for me, is a really powerful way that people of color have responded to racism, both structural racism and racism in the everyday. But there are other art forms, right? I mentioned the epistolaries. I have a student right now that's looking at letters that are written from Native American parents to their sons and daughters in boarding schools, and letters that went back from the children back to their parents. I mean, that's an art form as far as I'm concerned, these letter writing. We often sort of don't think about letters as an art form. I love to look at public art, mural art. I've been looking at that for decades, whether it's in Mexico or whether it's in Southern California, Northern California, or even the Central Valley. I go to places and I basically look at and study public murals as a response to everyday racism, as a response to racism. And LA was at one point the center of public murals in the United States, if not the world, next to probably Mexico. But it's an amazing sort of center. If you want to find go back in history, go to the Spark archives. Spark is, I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it's Judy Baca's center over in Venice, where it's about public art. She's documented some of the best documentation of public murals that you'll ever see, right? If that's something you want to look at and analyze. So what are some of the other responses to everyday racism? I think we've been seeing the Dreamer activist movement for at least 10, 15 years. I think you're seeing that's really just stepping up now because of what's happening post-election. I mean, dreamer activists, immigrant rights activists are really mobilizing, not just in universities and colleges, they're mobilizing our communities as well. And so I think you're seeing a lot of that as a response to everyday racism or everyday nativism that immigrant communities are experiencing. The Black Lives Matter movement also is another response to everyday racism. I mean, the Black Lives Matter, I think it began after Trayvon Martin's murder, about 3-4 years ago, right? And then some of the subsequent murders of African-American males and females around the country, right? I think you're seeing more and more of that activism taking place. An activism that people are very uncomfortable with, right? Very uncomfortable with. But basically, they've chosen how they're going to respond to racism in the everyday or structural racism. But you're seeing more and more of that. In the fall of 2015, that was an interesting sort of period in our university histories. There was a lot of action on our colleges and universities in the fall of 2015. University of Missouri is one example where the students basically went on strike. There was actually a hunger strike of at least one student there at the University of Missouri, basically calling for the university to denounce and to do something about everyday racism that they were experiencing at the University of Missouri campus, right? It ended with the president resigning, the chancellor of the system resigning, but the question becomes, what has happened since? I mean, how do we continue to put our universities, like UCLA or like PCC, keep their feet to the fire about some of these issues? That's always a concern. Universities often will say, they'll often say, they won't say it public, they'll say, well, I guess, when is summer coming? Or when is the break coming? Thinking that it'll go away during the break, or it'll go away during the summer. And unfortunately, sometimes it does. More and more, it's not. But I think these are examples of it. It doesn't end at the end of a term or the end of an academic year. In that same period, Harvard Law School, in November of 2015, something happened there too. Here's a banner headline from the Washington Post. Harvard Law has serious racism problem. Dean says after black professors' portraits were defaced. The New York Times said this, black tape at Harvard Law. So this is what it was. On that evening before the 19th, it must have been the 18th or sometime during that evening, early morning, someone went into the Harvard Law School suite of faculty offices and put black tape across African-American professors' portraits. So you have Professor Tomiko Brown-Nagin, black taped. You have Randall Kennedy, black taped. You have Professor Tuttle, Elizabeth Tuttle, black taped. Professor Ronald Sullivan, black taped. But here's what happened at Harvard Law that same day. This is what Professor Ronald Sullivan said. As you can see along his portrait, but all the portraits of African-American faculty, people started putting Post-its. So this is what he said. I love my Harvard Law School students. They've replaced acts of defacement with love notes to all the black faculty. So basically students and staff came into those offices and replaced the black tape with these notes. And so I'm calling them those microaffirmations, right? I'm defining them as these often small and or brief interactions that make people feel acknowledged and valued, just like Professor Sullivan. But you probably experience these all the time in various contexts. And I want to name them, these microaffirmations that we experience. And so I shared this, and I'm not sure if this happens to you, it probably does. When I read that piece, I knew I had read something like this someplace else, right? And I read it almost 20 years before that, in a book called by Henry Louis Gates, professor of African American Studies at Harvard, called Colored People, subtitle a memoir. And in the beginning of that book, if you don't want to buy the book, just Google it and you'll see the first page. It's a letter to his daughters. Again, getting back to that epistolary, right, that I mentioned, this idea of letters. And so in that letter to his daughters, this is the context. They had seen him acknowledge another African American, and they got embarrassed. They didn't know what he was doing. They got embarrassed of their father. So this is a letter to them. This is a letter to his daughters. This is what he told them. And I'll read this. He said, "Dear Maggie and Liza, last summer I sat at a sidewalk cafe in Italy, and 3 or 4 black Italians walked casually by. Each spoke to me. Rather, each nodded his head slightly or acknowledged me with a glance ever so subtly. When growing up, we always did this with each other, passing boats in a sea of white folk, which is why I still nod to, or speak to black people on the streets, and why it feels so good to be acknowledged by the Afro-Italians who pass my table at that cafe in Milan. Above all, I enjoy the unselfish and self-conscious moments of a shared cultural intimacy, where whatever form they take, when no one else is watching, when no white people are around. And I hope you'll understand why I continue to speak to colored people I pass on the streets." So this acknowledgement, right, this everyday acknowledgement, as simply as a nod, is so important. Again, I call those micro-affirmations that happen in the everyday. Sometimes Latinos, we do this in restaurants where the servers or the people who pick up your plates, you acknowledge them often in Spanish. And sometimes that's just a micro-affirmation. It's an affirming of their dignity, right? Of their validation of who they are as a person in that context. Because often they don't get that, unfortunately. And so, other examples of micro-affirmation. I went back and I shared this with our teacher education program and our Principals Leadership Institute to ask them, and I give you 2 examples. One of our teachers said this. She says, as I gave this part of the presentation, he said, "My mother given me a bendición, or a blessing, when I leave the house or when she dropped me off at school." Something as simple as a bendición, a blessing. I call that a micro-affirmation. It's a mother or a father or a grandparent or an aunt or a nina or nino basically affirming you who you are in this world. And then this principal, in our Principals Leadership Institute, she shared this with me, or us, last year at the presentation. She said, "My morning ritual," this is an African-American principal, training to be a principal, "my morning ritual of combing my daughter's hair and telling her how beautiful she is." And she pulled out the comb. She actually had it in her purse. She pulled it out and she did it for us. She started showing us, visually what she was doing. Because I know that's not how the world sees her. So this is her morning ritual, right, that she shares every morning with her daughter. I call that a micro-affirmation, a mother to a daughter or a mother to a son. And that's how I'm seeing this concept. So we don't have time here, but I'd like to know, what are some of the other types of micro-affirmations that you experience? Here at PCC, when you go home, when you go to your workplace, wherever you find yourself. We're trying to document these things now and see, okay, what do they look like? Are we missing something in these micro-affirmations? And the best place to ask is places like this, right? And so, as I wrap this up, 5 things I want you to remember about racial microaggressions, okay? First, the micro and microaggressions doesn't mean less than. The micro and microaggression means in the everyday. The second, remember the cumulative impact of verbal and nonverbal microaggressive assaults on people of color. The cumulative impact of these both verbal and nonverbal assaults on people of color. There's a story of Chet Pierce taught at Harvard, but every day he would travel by this statue on his way to Harvard Medical School at this glorieta, this sort of turnaround or roundabout. It was a statue, a huge statue of Abraham Lincoln sitting on this chair, and an African American at his feet in a diaper. And he said, every day I had to see that. And it just affected me every day. I got sick to my stomach every day, or the days that he drove by that statue, because it was on the way from home to work. And he writes about that everyday form of that microaggression. But that's not a verbal, that's a nonverbal, that's a visual. So we see it in statuary. Or we see it in photos. Sometimes we look at, I was just back from Washington at the National Academy of Science, and you go into these rooms with all these scientists, and you look at the pictures. They're mostly white men, right? So I guess there's a message there to me. Anybody else who walks into that room, that for me, that's an assault. That's a microaggressive assault. That's a nonverbal assault. That's a visual assault. When I don't see myself in textbooks, we have a project right now, me and Lindsay Perez-Uber at Cal State Long Beach. We're looking at children's books. We've collected over 250 children's books in the last 5 years on Latinos. And we're doing an analysis of those books, not just visual analysis of the pictures, right, of the sketches, but we're also looking at the words, the narrative, as microaggression. When young kids read or they see their history distorted or their experience distorted in these children's books, it's an assault, right? And we have an article, if you want to check it out, we have an article that I'll share with Cynthia that we just wrote on this, on this idea of visual microaggressions, where we actually used the example of her daughter. She reading a children's book to her daughter and seeing this as she was reading it and the experience that she went through, both her and her daughter. So now, because of that, her daughter's now our research assistant. She's now 13. She was 9 at the time. And she's helping us look at these children's books. But you can look at high school textbooks. You can look at many different ways in which people don't see themselves in text or see themselves distorted in text or other ways that we can analyze these various, what I would call nonverbal assaults on people of color. And the accumulation of that over time. It's unfortunately, it's rare that you will see a positive example in many of our textbooks. I know when I grew up in my textbooks, I seen very little positive imagery of Mexicans or Latinos or African Americans or Native Americans. Very little, or Asian Americans for that matter. Third, microaggressions matter because they're symptoms of larger structural problems. Again, I'm a sociologist, right? And those structural problems are racism and white supremacy. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, that's what I'm looking at, right? These are the larger structural problems, of which racial microaggressions is a symptom of these larger structural problems. Fourth, we need to acknowledge and disrupt the discourses of racial microaggressions in the everyday. Now, this is easier said than done. In the everyday, when you experience these things, we're saying that you have to acknowledge them, and then you have to disrupt them. I mean, sometimes the acknowledge piece is difficult, sometimes not. But the disruption piece is a little more difficult. Sometimes you're in a situation where it's going to be difficult to disrupt. Right? It may be your teacher says something in your classroom. Right? Or your TA says something in your section. Or someone says something in a public context in which you're not a part of, but you heard. Do you enter into that discussion? Do you disrupt that discussion around everyday racism? And then finally, we need to validate, affirm the dignity and humanity, and support one another as a response to everyday racism. So, these are what racial microaggressions are, and this is why I believe they matter in the everyday. Thank you. Can I share one more slide? I didn't put it in.
Yeah.
I just put it together this morning because it came out in yesterday's LA Times. Let's see if, where'd it go? No. It's coming up. I better just do it right. Okay. Yesterday in the LA Times, if you read the the California sections, section B, page 4, there was this article, waiter questions citizenship is fired. Anybody read that article yesterday's Times? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. This is an example of what we've been talking about today, right? They're at this restaurant in Huntington Beach, California, and this waiter at this it sounds like it's a high-end restaurant, basically says, this is what the woman said. She said, it was actually 2 women, 2 sisters, and then 2 others came after, right? The waiter asked, can I see your proof of residency? I need to make sure you're from here before I serve you. So what they did is that they got upset. They told the manager wanted to reseat them. They said, no, we're leaving, they left. But they did something that I guess in my generation, that I don't have the tools to do this, but they went onto Facebook and Yelp. And they started Facebooking that and Yelping it. And he found out and he wanted to talk to them. The manager wanted to talk to them. He said that they fired the person, the server, and they wanted to bring them back, their family, for an all expenses paid dinner or whatever at that restaurant. They refused. But I think they took down the post, though, the Facebook or Yelp post. I think that's what the article said. But there's something else happening here that I want to just share with you. It was kind of hard to, this is what the women are saying. They said it was kind of hard to process because we've never experienced this. Getting back to that acknowledgement and response. Disrupting, as I said earlier, they didn't know what to do. It was difficult for them to do, in real time, it was difficult for them to respond. They waited till they got home and they used the tools they had that were very disruptive, right? And that proved so. But there's something else that happened here that I want to share with you. One last little piece right here. She said, she describes herself and her sister as light-skinned Latinas. And she went on to say, for this to happen to us is kind of an eye-opener. So again, getting back to the ways in which we experience racism in the everyday, sometimes secondary targets, right? Sometimes those secondary targets are people that don't look Latino, right? They can pass for somebody else, right? And they often hear things like this and see things like this, that it's not directed towards them, it's directed towards someone else, right? And so I think this example of it is a good example of it. But it's also problematic in many ways because they're assuming some privilege in being light-skinned as opposed to being darker-skinned. It gets at that phenotype I talked about in my definition, right? That was one of the criteria. That not just race, gender, class, but I also put their phenotype, skin color, right? So, I'm sorry, colorism, you said? Yeah. Colorism, exactly. And that often happens within a group, and not just Latinos and Latinas. It happens with other groups as well.
Thank you, Dr. Solorzano. We have time for questions and answers. We have time for Q&A. I know we have a lot of faculty in the audience, and bringing a researcher here, a scholar who gives us an overview, it informs our practice. So I think, I can go through. I see faculty, I see classified staff, administrators, and students. For faculty, I think some takeaways that I was thinking about was our prompts that we use in classrooms. Getting students together in groups to do group work inside a classroom, I think would help to, take the power structure away so that if a student is experiencing a microaggression, they would feel more comfortable to voice that they're experiencing it. Also, culturally relevant books, right? Making sure even if you're using an excerpt from a book, that it's a book that maybe addresses these issues head on. For the staff, the classified staff who support students outside of the classroom and potentially inside the classroom if you're working like as a lab tech or roles like this, potentially being that person that a student formulates trust with. Because we do know that if a student is experiencing microaggressions in one area of the college, as long as they have somebody to go and talk about this with, and they feel safe discussing the impact of the microaggression, that would help. If you're somebody from like public relations, I see someone from PR here, facilities, You know, think about the images, the stories that we put out there to represent PCC. Even things like a community member told me, you know, we call the cafeteria the piazza, and many of our students don't know what a piazza is. It's a very Eurocentric terminology, and it's fancy. You know, that's a fancy word for cafeteria. What does that say about PCC? Is that a racial microaggression to the 30,000 students who attend here? And, you know, funny story using humor, as Dr. Solorzano said, in Facebook I saw a student saying, hey, there's really good hot cocoa in the pizzeria. And someone said, there's a pizzeria on campus? And then they said, yeah, it's by the Circadian. That's the piazza. See, our students, you know, so there's so many things that we can still do at PCC in order to make the environment such that all of us are focusing and able to focus all our efforts on succeeding. But are there any questions for Danny? Charlotte, Human Resources.
When you were going over the arts, has anyone done a study regarding rap music? I heard a little bit, but I don't know what it's all about with Snoop Dogg's most recent commentary on Trump. Has anyone done any kind of study on that?
Not that I know of, but I'm going to share something with you. Again, this is I'm giving away my age, but I was meeting with a student last week, and we were talking about epistolary. We were talking about different ways in which he can interview people, both living and gone. And so we were sort of brainstorming in my office. And I told him about an interview that me and my former student, Dolores Delgado Bernal, did, where she was at Utah, I was at UCLA, and we created this interview that looks like we're right there in the same room, but we weren't. We were doing it through email. And so I said, you know, there are probably different ways that we can do this. I mean, you can develop these interviews of people who are both living and dead and have them in conversation with each other, right? And he said, have you heard of Kendrick Lamar? And I said, no. He said, well, and I forgot, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I forgot the actual track on one of his albums where Kendrick Lamar, it's the last track on this album, I know that, where Kendrick Lamar is actually in conversation with Tupac. And we played it in my office, and I'm thinking to myself, this is exactly what we're talking about, right? In other words, he didn't interview Tupac, but actually, if you listen to it, he's actually engaged in a conversation with him. It never happened, but it's a beautiful sort of way in which we can communicate. We can put people in conversation with each other that were never in conversation with each other. And I think that's the beauty of counter storytelling. I know in the Puente program you using some of that. I mean, that's one of the ways that we can do that. But in answer to your question about the rap, no, not that I know of. I think it's really important that we look at it. Just like I think, I mentioned humor, and I only mentioned Dave Chappelle, but some of us are of a generation where we remember Moms Mabley, an African-American woman comedian, an amazing comedian, who was talking about race at a time when we weren't talking about race in that way, right? Dick Gregory is another one, right? Some of you probably know or remember Richard Pryor. He's another amazing comedian. I can go down the list of comedians where I think they've been teaching us about responses to everyday racism, both in the structural form and in interpersonal form.
Yeah. And Dr. Solorzano keeps mentioning counter storytelling. That's another teaching method that can be utilized inside the classroom to help support students. Counter storytelling, if you want to look at it.
But you know, one thing that I didn't emphasize here that I probably should have, and before I was walking in the hallways, one of the responses to everyday racism that we found in our research, right, is counter spaces, the creation of counter spaces. And so I was looking down the hall here, and I seen the Puente room there, and I seen Ujima. I seen that. I seen the Black Success. Yeah. I mean, these are counter spaces, right? These are places, and we have them at UCLA. Today's Monday, but if you come to UCLA Wednesday at 12 o'clock, you go to the Bruin, the Big Bear, down in the middle of their campus, It's called Black Wednesday. That's where African American students come on Wednesday from 12 to 2. Basically, it's a social space, but it's a space where black students come to acknowledge each other, to affirm each other, to validate each other, and to find out what's happening, right? It could be a political space, but it's most often a social space. At a place like UCLA, where there are so few African Americans, it was created for that reason. They found that space for that reason. But I have former students who study libraries as counter spaces, right? And so whether it's the Black Research Center there at UCLA as a counter space where black students come, or the Chicano Studies Research Center Library where Chicano students come to basically find a place to work. Sometimes it's not a social space, it's a workplace. But they know they can be in that space and they can feel acknowledged in that space. So this idea of counter space is another part of this that I didn't really mention, but it's also another response to everyday racism.
Any other questions from anyone? I do know something, being the person who's been responsible for leading the student equity effort at PCC. I do hear people, I try and be neutral, because I'm here for people who may not be aware, right, the intent. So last year we spent a whole lot of time, a lot of effort bringing in experts to talk about unconscious bias, implicit bias, because a lot of people aren't aware. I also hear people, say, well, how come we're not teaching African American or Latino students to provide solutions and not just be in the pain of racism or just be angry about the way things are? We should move on and try and solve the problems. And I think what I heard you say about that is we have to be acknowledged that this exists, and validation that racism exists, both an individual and structural and institutional. That's very important. That's what you were including in this, right?
Yes, and I've given a talk similar to this. It's variations of it. I gave this talk to all 10 UC campuses, to all of the senior leadership at UC. So we were at all 10 I did 5, Lindsay Perez-Huber did the other 5. But we would come for a 4-hour seminar with all the department chairs, all the deans, all the senior leadership, except for the chancellor. He or she was the only one that wasn't asked to attend, which I think they should have been there. But the bottom line is that we would have meetings like this, and at some point in the Q&A, they would ask me, what do we do, right? And I asked them, how many of you, and I asked this, at least 5 of the campuses, in the UC system, all senior leadership, how many of you, when you're in elementary school or middle school, took an ethnic studies course or learned about someone else other than what was in your textbooks? Someone, African American, Latino or Latina, Native American, Asian American. I would get virtually no hands up. How many of you in high school took an ethnic studies course? Right? Nothing. How many of you at the university, when you're an undergraduate, took an ethnic studies course? Virtually nobody. I said, well, that maybe you just asked, all of our campuses, we're asking first-year students to take a diversity course or an ethnic studies course, and you haven't taken them. Shouldn't you take these courses, or shouldn't you do something basically to acknowledge someone else's history, someone else's experience? That didn't go over too well. But the bottom line is I felt I had to tell them that, right? Because I have to tell you that I didn't take my first ethnic studies course until I was at the university. I never took those courses in high school or elementary school or middle school. It just didn't happen, right? I think that's one way that I think places like PCC or UCLA or Cal State Northridge, just to continue to support ethnic studies. I think that's important. We're seeing it in our high schools. There's a piece of state legislation that's not quite where it should be, but it's basically saying that all high school students who graduate from the state of California at some point are going to have to take an ethnic studies course. I wish it was a little bit more beefed up than that, but I'm willing to go move in time, but that's sure better than what I had as a high school student. And I would love to see that happen throughout the state of California. in other states as well.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why we bring speakers like Dr. Solorzano and we're focusing on these issues is because when we look at our overall student success data, there are two groups of students for all 13 divisions who have achievement gaps. So it's a common theme. It's African American and Latino students. And so we know in order to improve our success rates for our students from these two communities that we have to change our practices. So our hope is that by bringing in experts that we can learn from them and then change our practices. Elsie?
We also know, I mean, we're sitting right down the hall here. Puente is one of those programs that does that,
Yes.
right? And we know it's successful. I mean, but we know, unfortunately, we know that it only meets the needs of a certain number of students, which is also a challenge.
Yes.
Because I do work on community colleges. I do work on math, right? On the developmental math. And most of you probably know this, or many of you probably know this, that if there's one issue in the community college system right now that is the biggest part of the leakage in the educational pipeline for Latinas and Latinos and African Americans, it's developmental math.
Guess what? Good news. At PCC, our math faculty just voted last month to eliminate 3 levels of remedial math. So all students will come in at pre-college algebra.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
But Puente program basically takes students who are one level below developmental or transfer level English,
Yep.
and has a special program. But the special part of that program is it provides culturally responsive literature,
Yes.
experiences in that space, right? Do you know of any school, I'm hoping you're going to say yes, but do you know of any school where you have culturally relevant mathematics, like a Puente program for mathematics? I think that's something we should consider.
Yeah, that would be great.
I mean, that's an issue that I was telling Cynthia earlier. I shared this research on developmental math. I was at Oregon State University last week or 2 weeks ago, talking about this, right? And they have a very much smaller system. They have 17 community colleges, right? We have 113. It's a very different space, but they're dealing with the same issues,
Yes.
right? The quote remedial math and English. But my thing right now is about math, because I think we're losing too many students, especially at the community colleges, because they can't make their way to transfer level math. And if you can't make your way to transfer level math, you're basically pushed out of the system. And we lose them. And we're losing too many students. So I want to think of new ways. And maybe that's one way. We've talked about this before in other spaces, where you sort of reduce the number of sort of leakages in the pipeline that could occur. But also, I think the curriculum could be made much more relevant to students.
Yeah.
So.
Very good. Okay, Elsie, you had your hand up.
Do that in peer-to-peer situations?
You know, this question I probably get, it's usually the first question I get. And I often say that obviously I don't have the answers, all the answers. But we've been talking about this for many, many years. And my students over the years, we've been saying that we should come up and write either a book, write an article, write some sort of publication of what we're calling the arsenals of responses. The different ways in different contexts that people might respond. Because like these women, you read the article, they got stuck. They said, we were stunned. We were stunned to silence, really. And that happens too often. You know, you don't know what to say. And so you go home and you have to deal with it, right? And it really, you take it with you. And taking it with you every day or all the time, that's what I'm talking about, has health effects. We know that from some of that health literature, the public health literature that I was mentioning earlier. So we're trying to come up with these arsenals of responses. So I gave this presentation, or similar presentation, to our Principals Leadership Institute there at UCLA in December. I'm coming back in May, and I'm trying to think of something way different to engage with them, right? They want a sort of a follow-up. And so I contacted one of my former students. He's at Cal State Dominguez. His name is Miguel Gutierrez, who used to work with Gustavo Bol, Theater of the Oppressed. And so he was trained by Gustavo. So we're going to come in May, and we're basically going to do theater with them. We're going to engage in theater about responses. And we're going to, I don't know if you've ever been in a Gustavo Bol sort of workshop, but basically it's really interactive. And, you could be here first, and then they say, okay, you're out, you're in. How would you respond? And then, boom, it's a really interactive approach. So for me, to give these principles, or these principles in training, sort of tools, because sometimes that's what happens. We get stunned into silence, right? And so we want to get people to sort of learn how to respond or relearn. I think it's there. I'm a Freudian. It's there. It's just finding, just sparking it again. Because sometimes, you say things that, sometimes you do it anyway. You say things that you say, wow, God, should I have said that? I said it, right? And so you have it in you. As a Freudian, it's just, as an educator, trying to tap into that. And we're trying to use theater to tap into that.
My mom's a sociologist, and I was raised by, I always say, well, Mom, they don't realize. Oh, they realize it, Cynthia, come on, So I get what you're saying. And every movie I see, did you see? They were denigrating women. They were, I'm like, yep, I see it, yeah. But I just want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us. Thank you all for attending. I want to thank the Association of Latino Employees, Yahaira de la Paz, the president. And then also Tito Altamirano, he helped with this project and this program. Kathy Barnes from my office for student equity. And then Yahaira has surveys, or if you've all filled those out, if you could please leave them at the door for us. That would be appreciated. And make sure you signed in so we can keep track for faculty, staff, and managers who attend. If you attend 4 workshops this year, you're earning a laptop for our student laptop loan program for next year. Thank you.